The intent of the founders of the Hayward lectures, as I understand the intent, was to bring the resources of scholarship in a wide variety of disciplines to bear on various aspects of religious belief and practice. Since the only religious tradition of which I have any detailed knowledge is the Christian tradition, my references to religion or to religious belief and religious practice will be to that tradition. My own area of study is philosophy, and so I shall address the general title of this series, Perspectives on Faith, from the point of view of the question, what can philosophical reflection contribute to the understanding of Christian faith? That is, to the understanding of the beliefs and practices which are distinctive of Christianity. But this question is far too broad as it stands, and so we'll have to spend a bit of time narrowing the focus. There are any number of ways in which a philosophical inquiry into religion might begin, and I've chosen to look at a set of issues which arise out of reflection on the Christian claim that God acts in the world. That is, that God does things, brings about events in history and nature. Now, I choose this point of departure for two reasons. First, the idea of divine action is basic to Christian faith, and it is one of my purposes tonight to spell out the senses in which this is the case. Second, while philosophers and theologians from ancient to modern times have had many things to say on the subject of divine action, the past 50 years have seen a steady rise of interest in this topic. In fact, in the last decade or two, there have been international conferences on the subject. As Dr. Ashley mentioned, I was fortunate enough to attend some of these. There have been a large number of scholarly articles and several major books on this topic. In the light of these facts, I thought it might be of interest to a general audience to be brought up to date on the state of scholarship on this whole matter. I shall proceed as follows. I'll begin with a review of the kinds of evidence which support the claim that the idea of divine action is basic to Christian belief and practice. Then I shall outline some arguments which purport to show that this idea is so problematic that we really don't understand it or don't know how to apply it to anything in any systematic or rationally controllable way. In looking at these arguments, we will be able to identify three major questions raised by the idea of divine action in the world. The first question, how could it ever be shown that the belief that God acts is true, or likely to be true, or is in some way rationally justified? Is God known by experience? If so, what kind? Are there logically convincing arguments to support the view that God acts in the world? Or are there considerations of other kinds which show that the religious believer is entitled to his faith commitments? The second question, what does talk about divine action mean? Is such language devoid of significance? The third question, assuming that God acts in the world, how would we ever identify a divine act? I will go on to suggest that in the long run, the resolution of such difficulties turns on the issue of what model or models of action which might be used. For there are a number of different models or basic analogies, comparisons, in terms of which God's action might be conceived, that is, thought about. I shall describe three models and to try to determine their respective strengths and weaknesses. To do this is to raise the question of whether or not there might be criteria for determining whether one model is preferable to another. I deal with this matter only in passing by noting some theological considerations which are particularly relevant to Christian faith conceived of as a complex structure of belief and practice. I simply want to repeat that point. I use the word Christian faith, which is in the title of this series, to mean a complex structure of belief and practice peculiar to the Christian tradition. I will try to offer some tentative conclusions. First, I think that the idea of divine action easily survives certain kinds of arguments which purport to show that it is meaningless. On the other hand, there does remain a problem with respect to regarding the idea of divine action as an explanatory concept. Second, at least one of the models I explore has, I believe, real possibilities for suggesting how those three above questions can be answered. Nevertheless, even for one, it's not all clear sailing. Finally, I suggest that reflection on the idea of divine action in the world might lead to certain conclusions about how one thinks of faith in relation to unbelief. Well then, why should we suppose that the idea of divine action is in some sense basic to Christian faith? The most superficial examination of the Scriptures makes two things very clear. First, large numbers of verbs are action words, large numbers of words have God as their subject. Second, even when the action in biblical stories is carried on by people or nations or cities or whatever, it is still God who is often the hero of the story. God is depicted as working often behind the scenes to bring about various outcomes. God is said to think, to feel. God has goals, aims, objectives. God makes plans. God sometimes changes his mind. God has conversations with people, gives them instructions, enters into agreements with them, covenant, biblical word. God has various other labels as well. God is said to be a king, a judge, a shepherd, and a warrior, to name a few of them. In short, when God is described, it is usually in terms drawn from the ordinary vocabulary by which we describe ourselves. One of the things we say about ourselves is that we do things. We are agents. That is, we human beings do various things. We make things happening by acting in one way or another. For example, I can raise my arm just by raising it. Easy. I'm doing something. I can also move a blackboard brush, the eraser here, from one end of, I won't do it, I need this. But anyway, I could move it off the end of the table just by pushing it. Now, it is most significant for our present purposes that God is also spoken of as an agent. Any number of examples can be cited from the Bible, for example. Take the creation story. God speaks, action, and things just come into being. Light, dry land, oceans within their limits, and sun, moon, stars, plants, and animals, human beings. Then there's the Exodus story. God tells Moses, another action, to wave his staff, and then God makes plagues happen in Egypt. God also sends a wind to part the Red Sea. God places a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night to guide the Hebrews across the Sinai desert. Then there are the conquest stories of how God made the walls of Jericho fall down and how God made the sun stand still so that a battle could be finished. Now, what these stories show, if merely at the level of the most elementary grammatical and literary analysis, is the extent to which God is thought of on the model of an intelligent agent who brings things and events about in the world by action. Of course, it's no accident that these stories are structured in terms of the idea of divine activity, for this idea is absolutely basic to the historiography of the biblical writers. Recall, for example, the central theme of the oldest strand in the Hebrew historical corpus. That part of the Old Testament which modern scholars have called the J source. This narrative tells the story of Israel, ancient Israel, from its most unlikely beginnings in a nondescript bunch of escaped slaves. And it takes the story of these people to their historical pinnacle as a great nation. And it is all done by God. One finds a similar perspective in some of the prophets. For example, Amos and Isaiah think of God as the great choreographer of history. God moves a nation here, another one there, and another one still someplace else. The same historiographical presupposition underlies the New Testament. One might cite as an example Peter's sermon in Acts 2, part of which reads as follows. Men of Israel, listen to me. I speak of Jesus of Nazareth, a man singled out by God, made known to you through miracles, portents, and signs, which God worked among you through him, as you well know. When he had been given up to you by the deliberate will and plan of God, you used heathen men to crucify and kill him. But God raised him to life again, setting him free from the pangs of death, because it could not be that death should keep him in its grip. Now, this text reflects part of the content of early Christian preaching, and thus it is very good evidence that the notion of divine activity in the world is a key organizing concept for the first century church in its attempt to spell out the significance of the career of Jesus and to talk about its own place, the church's own place in history. It might be objected here that the grammatical and literary facts which I've mentioned are evidence only that some people long ago told themselves some stories for entertainment or for moral enlightenment and so on. You can support almost any theory by quoting the Bible in the right way, so I suppose there's something to be said for the view. In any case, there can be no doubt that some of the material in the Bible, a good deal of it, does serve social and political functions. As one author puts it, it is identity literature, literature whose function is to evoke and conserve those features of a social entity which constitute its identity. In this way, the Hebrew Scriptures call to mind the shared history and tradition which made Israel a nation. Similarly, the New Testament dramatizes the life of Jesus in a way which constantly reminds Christians of their basic loyalties. Nevertheless, I think it is obvious that the biblical writers themselves thought that when they were talking about God causing events in the world, they were saying something that went beyond mere service of social purposes and enforcement of cultural values. They thought that they were talking about events that really happened, that is, events in ordinary time and at a place on the surface of the earth, events which involved actual flesh and blood human beings in the ordinary circumstances of human life. It's intended to be sober history. History in the sense of a description of events whose occurrence is in principle testable by reference to eyewitnesses. Of course, it is history with a difference. The difference is that the occurrence of some of the events is ascribed to God as their agent. Now, much the same point can be made by examining Christian doctrine. And I'll simply remind you of certain doctrines, Christian beliefs, the idea of providence, the idea of creation, the idea of revelation, incarnation, miracles, and so on. All of these involve the idea of divine action. I think the best way to grasp the conceptual structure of a religion like Christianity, however, is to see how it works in practice. And here, if anywhere, we get some sense of how people of faith actually understand what they are doing and how they participate in religion and how they understand the connection between faith and the various domains of thought and action which they share with people who are not of faith. In Christianity, worship has been structured for many centuries on the pattern of divine call, a verb, and human response. In other words, the thought structure underlying what Christians do in the formal observance of their faith is that God does something and human beings respond. Well, let me summarize that first part. The scriptures, creeds, hymns, prayers, the public and private piety of the Judeo-Christian tradition are virtually incomprehensible apart from the presupposition of divine activity. This tradition holds that God reveals his nature through what he does, and that God's rational creatures fittingly, correctly adore him for what he is, and correctly praise and thank him for his saving activity. The tradition encourages people of this faith to commune with God in prayer and to conform themselves as much as possible to his divine nature. And it assures them of his continuing providential care for them. Doctrine is conceived of as accurate statements of what God does or has done, and practical piety is conceived of as human response to it. Now, I might have belabored this point, but I wanted to put some stress on it because it's important at the outset to realize how central this idea of divine action is to Christian faith and practice. The basic point that I wanted to make here is that this idea is central to Christianity, not merely in a literary way, but it's central to the way in which Christian faith thinks about the world, in technical language, it's an ontological idea. It's a philosophical word which stands for what is done in order to answer this question. Ontology. In other words, in the way in which Christians have thought about the world, the whole idea that God acts is not just a figure of speech, but has something to say about the nature of the world. Now, this has very important consequences, because if the idea of divine action cannot be made good as an ontological idea, Christian faith must undergo a very radical rethinking. And, of course, that's not news, because many students of religion have already done that kind of radical rethinking from many points of view, and their arguments should be carefully studied by those who aspire to religious leadership. I'm not going to discuss any of them here, because I want to focus more particularly on the issue of what must be presupposed if the idea of divine action is going to work as an ontological idea. And so I will turn to that task now and talk about some philosophical issues that are raised by the idea of divine action. There have been a number of arguments which purport to show that the idea of divine action is so problematic we don't understand it. It's been commonly assumed, for example, through a large part of the history of Christianity, that there are two main ways by which God is known: by revelation and by natural reason, that is, reason unaided by revelation. Now, the argument goes, If Christians are going to deal with skeptics, it's not plausible to begin with appeals to revelation because skeptics don't believe it anyway. Fortunately, however, natural reason is a common possession, and it is sufficient to make the case, or at least to make a reasonable case. And if we can show that the existence of God is supported by strong reasons, perhaps amounting even to logical proof, then that will remove prejudices against saying other things about God, such as that God acts in the world. Now, it might seem at first glance that this is exactly how we should proceed. However, it is just a very difficult task to proceed in that way because it leads us, or can lead us, into a certain kind of very curious argument. We might suggest that we should find some event or experience which we can't explain by any scientific laws, and then attribute it to divine agency. But when we put the matter this way, it is easy to recognize the suggestion as nothing but the long discredited God of the gaps strategy. I'll explain in a minute what that is. There are two reasons on the whole why this strategy won't work. First, scientific knowledge grows, and events for which there was once no explanation are now coming well within the scope of things we understand. Anybody who adopts the God of the gaps strategy, in other words, working up a problem, leaving a gap in explanation, and once we've got a nice absence of explanation, we say, God did it. See? God of the gaps. Anybody who adopts this strategy faces the need either for constant retrenchment of the position as our understanding grows, or for having to fly in the face of theory which is deeply and broadly supported on evidence which is open to public observation, confirmation. Now, the second reason why this strategy won't work is a more basic logical point. Assume we're going to set out to establish the existence of something, say a zooble. I want you to know how to spell this. A zooble. Do zoobles exist? Do zoobles exist? Thank you. Anyone want to challenge that? Do zoobles exist?
How do you know they exist?
If you asked me that question, I'd ask you what they are. That's how I'd start. In fact, I think that has to be our first question. What is a zooble anyway? How can we determine whether there are any until we know what they are? Now, if I tell you what a zooble is, then it will be easy to find out whether there are any. I checked the dictionary to make sure there isn't such a word, by the way. So I can invent it, have this creative power. So the proper response to the question is, tell us what a zooble is, and then we can get on with the job of finding out whether there are any. Well, when we put the matter this way, we can see that the answer to the question, do zoobles exist, really depends on what we're going to mean by the word zooble. And the very same point applies to the idea of divine action. If we know what it is, if we know what counts as a divine act, then we have a good chance of finding evidence for it. And that's why my first question about the evidence and arguments for the reality of divine action, I think, is logically dependent upon the second question, namely, what does this talk about divine action mean? Now, I want to go on to discuss that a little bit. And it's convenient to begin with an argument advanced about 50 years ago by a German theologian and New Testament scholar, Rudolf Bultmann. He wrote a famous essay called The New Testament and Mythology, and he extended his discussion of this issue in a 1958 book called Jesus Christ and Mythology, and my comments are based mainly on the latter work. I'm not going to talk about everything he says. You would need constitutions of iron, and I would need a throat of brass, and we'd have to delay the first pitch of the game for a while. So I'll simply refer to things that are particularly relevant to my talk. Bultman makes much use of the idea of a worldview. Now, a worldview in philosophical jargon is a set of basic concepts together with a certain set of beliefs expressed in terms of those concepts. And these are concepts by which everything is described and understood. Such a set of concepts and beliefs might be said to constitute one's world. That is, your basic convictions about what is real and about how reality is structured and what kinds of things and events are possible or not possible. For example, if you think that the concept of cause is absolutely basic to the way we have to understand nature, and you also believe that every event has a cause, even if we don't know what it is, then you will also likely believe that freedom of choice is not possible. Or at best, you will believe that free choice doesn't mean absence of causes. We might describe your worldview then as deterministic. A worldview then can be thought of as a set of basic assumptions which we usually do not think about, but which we think with. Only philosophers think about them. Now, in Bultman's opinion, the worldview of the Bible is basically like this. There are three kinds of spiritual beings: God, other heavenly beings, God and other heavenly beings together, and then the second kind, humans, and third, demons, Satan and the infernal creatures. The universe has three stories. Heavenly beings live on the upper floor, humans live in the lower floor, and Satan and his angels are somewhere down there. Both divine and demonic beings are involved in what happens in the human world. They intervene in nature, and they partly determine the course of history. Divine and demonic action is intervention. Supernatural powers simply burst in upon the order of nature and into the sequence of historical events. Such intervention, Bultman alleges, is thought of as the interruption of the natural and historical orders and the assertion of a new event not connected with events in the preceding causal sequence. Events in history are something like this. If we take a slice of history out, we find that they're roughly related to each other in some way, but it's a bit of a loose fit. And if Satan or if God wants to intervene, it's possible to stick a divine act in there, and it then becomes part of the causal sequence. Actually, I suppose I should have put it in over here, like this, to show that other events might continue on that way. A bit of a loose fit. Now, Bultman claims this is mythological thinking. It reflects a worldview that we can no longer accept. Our worldview is scientific. We are committed to thinking of events as strictly determined, causally. Like this. There's no place for a divine action to get in there and do anything. Our modern understanding of science and history precludes the very possibility of thinking in terms of the operation of supernatural powers to bring about events in the world. Now, this leaves Bultman with a certain kind of problem. And it's a problem that is basically addressed to preachers. When people who are going to preach sermons need to get up on Sunday morning and say something, the problem they face is, what am I going to say? Now, if they reflect with Bultman, or agree with Bultman, that the worldview of the Bible is incompatible with our way of thinking about things, then this leads to a problem. When the Bible talks about God intervening in events using this model, we can't think of that in terms of this model. And so how are people going to understand what is said if somebody says, well, God will do something to you, God will help you, God will save you, care for you, and so on? How can God do that in this kind of world? He says, which we all believe. Now, whether he's right or wrong about that, I think is not particularly germane. I think he's asking the right question, nevertheless. Well, the problem that faces us then is that we have to interpret the New Testament. If we don't, it is meaningless, because we no longer share the worldview of the biblical writers. Now, I want to return to Bultman a bit later when we reflect on some of the proposed solutions for the problem of spelling out what talk of divine action means. But now I want to raise another kind of philosophical problem about divine action. In conversations with our friends, we often say such things as, that person standing by the door is an excellent musician. Or, the dog tied to that tree belongs to my brother. Now, a most remarkable event takes place when we say such things. The person to whom we speak normally is able to identify what we're talking about. And what's remarkable about this, is that we do it merely by means of language, and usually with good success. Now, the basic reason why this works is that we have linguistic devices which enable us to distinguish the subject we're talking about from other possible candidates. And this qualification is important because it's conceivable that I might say on some occasion, that person standing by the door is an excellent musician. And there might be somewhere in the world a person standing by the door who's not an excellent musician. Of course, that doesn't falsify my statement because we're limiting it to a context. And that point is important because it shows that in order to succeed in identifying what we're talking about, we have to have some kind of context, we have to have some criteria, principles, in terms of which to decide that we've actually identified the thing we want to identify. So certain conditions have to be satisfied. Now, for our purposes, it's not necessary to carry out a full analysis of such situations, nor even to determine whether what I've just said is entirely correct for all possible situations. The point is that certain conditions have to be satisfied if we are going to be able to identify what we're talking about, or have someone else identify what we're talking about. Now, it's been argued that if God is to be conceived as an agent who acts in various ways to bring about events in the world, then statements about God's activity can be successful only if it is possible to make identifying reference to God. But it is at just this point that the religious person seems to run into difficulty. For God is not an object of sense perception to start with. Hence, we can't say such things as, that dignified fellow over there who looks a lot like George Burns is God. He's the one over there who's translating some Aramaic for the little boy sitting at the table. Such descriptions fail because God has no sense-perceptible qualities whatsoever. Furthermore, God is not at any time or place, and therefore trying to point to God doesn't distinguish God from anything else. In face of difficulties of this sort, we might well ask, what do statements which seem to refer to divine actions actually refer to? Well, what do these arguments add up to? I've canvassed them in order to show how certain philosophical problems arise. The first was the general problem of how we justify or defend a religious belief. The second was whether the idea of divine action is meaningful. And finally, the third, we considered whether it's even possible to refer to God or to what God is doing. Now, I suggested earlier that the first problem is dependent on the second, but what about the second and third? And in order to deal with these, we'll have to take account of a more basic issue, namely the question of how the relation of the world to God might be conceived. Now, the reason why we have to do that is perfectly straightforward. If we say that God brings about events in the world, what is being claimed by the expression brings about? An initial response would be to say, well, if something or event is brought about by God, it is dependent on God. And that's a step forward. But then, what kind of dependence is involved here? There are several possibilities, and I'll only cite one or two, just as examples to show what kind of problem we have here. We might suggest that the world is dependent on God in the way in which a cabinet is dependent on the cabinet maker. And so we get something like this. That kind of relation. Or we might suppose that the world is dependent on God in the way in which, say, a concrete block is dependent on the stuff it's made of. So we'll have a relation like this. Now, these are obviously very different, and they have different consequences. In the first case, God's action is a kind of carpentry. God takes some material, he puts it into a shape which it would not have had without God's activity. The finished product is quite distinct from God, just as the cabinet is distinct from the cabinet maker. The second case is different. Here God acts by shaping himself, not some other material. God shapes himself in a certain way. And what God does is not distinct from God. And such examples, I think, show how the idea of divine activity in the world is conceived of, how it's conceived of, depends on the way in which we think of the relation of the world to God. Now, this leads us to what I think is a very fundamental question about this issue. What models are available by which to conceive of the relation of the world to God? And what principles might there be by which any specific model might be regarded as preferable to others? Now, I want to outline three proposals, maybe two, for dealing with these questions. And in passing, I shall note some criticisms. So we'll look now at some models of the world-God relation. I'm not going to use these, by the way. I have some other ones. Well, it's convenient again to recall Bultman's position. It's clear what model of the world-God relation he rejects, namely the one he believes underlies the New Testament, that three-story view of the universe. Now, on that model, an act of God is just as much, I should say very like, an action of ours. Just as we operate with free will and can insert an action of our own into one of these spaces between natural and historical events, so God can do that. The difference only is that all of our actions are observable, whereas God's actions are not observable. But the connections aren't so tight that God can't do that. As Bultman says, divine causality is inserted as a link in the chain of events which follow one another according to natural causation. However, if God's activity is thought of in that way, we should be able to treat divine activity scientifically. But we find to the contrary that we can't do this. And hence it's crucial for Bultman to insist that talk about the activity of God is not to be subjected to scientific criticism. For if claims about God's acts are to be scientifically verifiable, then there just aren't any to see. And hence Christian belief is simply false. Well, we can understand Bultman's reasoning here easily if we recall his allegation that underlying the modern scientific worldview is a theory of causation which pictures it as an absolutely tight chain. That one. No gaps, no loose links, no place to insert a divine act. Well, then how do we think of divine activity in that situation? Well, he says, God cannot be thought of as acting between events, so divine activity must be within the events. And that's what has to be explained. It might be thought that he's committed to pantheism at this point. Pantheism, you undoubtedly know, is the theory that God and the world are identical. So if we say God acts within events, are we committed to pantheism? Well, Bultman doesn't think so, because he thinks that we can identify divine activity acting in certain events, not all of them, at least as far as we know, but certainly in some of them, and we can identify that in a very clear way. And here's how he proposes to do it. The idea of divine action is intelligible only if it is linked to personal involvement in a life of faith. He believes that talk of divine action really expresses acknowledgement of one's, what he calls, existential situation. This is a matter of taking serious, life-shaping decisions about one's existential situation. And to do this is to enter into the life of faith. This is contrasted with the typical human drive. The life of faith is contrasted with the typical human drive for security and our efforts to protect ourselves from the contingencies of life. But our struggles to contrive our own security, to be masters of our fate, reflect a faulty assessment of human existence. What we must do, he says, is acknowledge our mortality, our imminent death, and ask ourselves, what am I going to do about that? Reflection of this sort leads us to a more sober appraisal of ourselves, a less ego-driven understanding of what is of true worth, a giving up of self-aggrandizement. God's action, he says, bestows upon us a new understanding of ourselves. But wouldn't this mean that a divine act is any occasion which gives rise to this kind of understanding? How do we know that it is an act of God which transforms us? Bultman tries to meet this challenge by saying that there's a difference between timeless philosophical truth, say that pantheism is true, something like this, therefore God's action is everywhere. There's a difference between timeless philosophical truth and the kind of self-understanding I have just described. His argument, as nearly as I can make it out, is that existential self-understanding does not occur through the grasp of philosophical theory and analysis. He's probably right. But talk about the act of God is not part of philosophical analysis and theory. Consequently, existential self-understanding is an act of God. Now, perhaps I'm being unjust to Bultman here, but if not, it's clear that the argument simply begs the question, because simply it begs the question of whether the only possible occasion of existential self-understanding is philosophy or the act of God. And the fact that one event is not brought about by another is no reason for concluding that it's not brought about by a third. I think I better do that over again. The argument, I think, is something like this. Existential self-understanding is brought about by either philosophy, the broad sense that I've used here, or an act of God. But it's not brought about by philosophical things, therefore, act of God. But where the argument fails is that he doesn't allow for the possibility that it might be brought about by something else, some third factor not mentioned. In any case, if the argument were sound, it would establish exactly what Bultman wishes to refute, namely that the act of God is whatever occasions a new self-understanding. His attempt to explain what an act of God is by modeling the notion on the idea of that which occasions in us a new kind of self-understanding seems to fail. It might be an important failure nevertheless, one that is instructive. For example, we might see his argument as essentially an attempt to tell us what the marks of divine activity are. From this point of view, we would see Bultman as addressing the question, how am I going to identify an act of God? And how am I going to do it in a way which does not lead me into conflict with natural science or critical history? His problem then becomes one of specifying the marks or the signs, the criteria, by which we pick out a divine act. And the problem is similar to that which occurs in bird watching. Is this a crow or a raven? They're both black, but then look at that heavy beak on that one. And it doesn't caw, it croaks. It's a raven. Is this an act of God? Well, have I reflected on my mortality? Have I realized the futility in the long run of my frantic efforts to secure myself against all contingencies? Have I faced my imminent death and given up my egocentric orientation to life and the world? Yes, this is an act of God. Now, if this is his argument, its flaw is that he has provided no way of showing that the expression act of God is not merely a synonym for new self-understanding. Well, what do we learn from Bultman? First, any attempt to identify a divine act by specifying criteria for it must not lead to a mere verbal solution. We have to get farther than showing how the expression divine act can be replaced by another expression. Well, I've spent a bit of time on Bultman, and that's enabled me to elucidate some important points. Now, I want to turn to another model. This time, I think we can skip that. It's remarkable how much you can skip when you really get down to the bare bones of it, isn't it? Don't need that either. I'm conscious of Tim's anxiety about the baseball game here. I don't need that either. We're making progress. The third, or in this tonight, the second model I want to examine is known by a somewhat strange name, double agency. Double agency. The basic idea, and I'll refine this in a minute, is that the activity of God is internal to the finite agent in such a way that what the finite agent, the creature, the human being, for example, what the finite agent does is also God's doing. The same. Both divine and finite agency are fully active in the same event. It's an ancient theory. It was held, for example, by the 13th century Christian theologian Thomas of Aquino, who spelled it out in terms of a distinction between primary and secondary causes. God, as primary cause, works through creatures as secondary causes. And he modeled this distinction on the relation between an agent and an instrument used by the agent to bring about an effect. For example, if I use an axe to split a log, then I can be said to have split the log, but so can the axe. And we can also think of other examples of the same kind. For example, two people cooperating to lift a heavy object, two people pulling on a bell rope, or one slightly different, the mayor might issue a proclamation by getting the town crier out to read it. And so in that way, the mayor acts through the town crier. The problem with these, however, is that they can all be reduced by redescription. And in the mayor and town crier example, we'd say, well, no, they're not. This is not really a case of double agency. This is simply a case of the mayor authorizing the proclamation and the town crier reading it. Two different acts. So what we have to try to make sense of then is the notion of double agency, what is not reducible. Well, the view that I want to look at is one that was advanced by Austin Farrer, whom Tim mentioned a few minutes ago. It's the idea of two agents for one identical action, and he wants to see what model might be suitable. Now, interestingly enough, he doesn't himself develop any of these models at any length, and the one I'm going to use is one that is suggested by him in some remarks that he made in an essay called Causes. And it goes something like this. What he suggests is that the whole idea of being persuaded of something by somebody else, say changing your mind about something, having a view altered by what somebody says, might be a good way of thinking about double agency. So we can work this out. I've often found myself in the following circumstance. I'm convinced, maybe passionately convinced, about the truth or the correctness of some point of view. Then I have a conversation with you, and as a result, I find that I change my mind, change my opinion. And this is an interesting event, for clearly you, by speaking, bring about my change of mind on the matter. Well, how does that happen? Well, we could talk about the sound waves and the impact of these things on the tympanic membrane and nerve impulses and things in the brain and so on. And yet we would never accept that as an explanation of why I changed my mind. What we require is a reference to the reasons. Well, you changed my mind by means of moral and rational persuasion. Now we could ask ourselves, is this event your act or mine? Well, in a way it's yours, for you did the persuading, and you succeeded. I mean, if you succeeded, that's what you accomplished, my mind change. On the other hand, changing my opinion, my mind, is obviously something I do. Now notice all the action words here. I certainly have to take responsibility for my opinion. It would be childish of me to blame you for them, at least if I'm a mature, responsible adult. This analogy needs much further analysis, I think, and we can't do it here, but I suggest that it might be very fruitful to develop it at length. Well, if we assume that the model of double agency can be given some kind of intelligibility along lines that I've suggested, we can then ask ourselves, what reasons would there be for anyone to believe that this is the way, or that there are divine acts in the world construed in this way? Well, again, we have to think about the Zubals. The way we go around determining whether Zubals exist is, after we know what they are, is to take a look. You know, we look under the table or in the drawer, if it's that kind of thing, on top of the roof, if it's that kind of thing. If it's the sort of thing that builds nests out in the trees, that's where we look. Once we know what it is, we can hunt for it. Here, my point is the hunting. The idea of the existence or the reality of something of that kind is largely tied up with the notion of how we actually go about finding out. We have to tie it to some kind of human behavior. Now, this principle can be applied to divine action. What we need to do is to show how talk about divine action can be connected to some of the regular routines of ordinary human life. Now, when Ferrer expresses this point, what he says is that when we think of the activity of God in a rational creature, what we need to focus on is the enhancement of the moral and social aspects of human life. For example, becoming a better person and helping other people to become better people, helping them, encouraging their moral aspirations and assisting them in their achievements. In this way, we largely make ourselves the kinds of persons we become, and we take part in the way in which others make of themselves what they become. For example, when we take extra care to prevent unworthy motives from clouding our decisions, we develop a habit of moral sensitivity and care. When we do kind deeds for others, settled habits of charity become dependable aids in making decisions regarding relations with other people and with the natural world. When we struggle to understand and appreciate others for themselves and not for any merely exploitive purposes that we have in our own minds, then we enhance our ability to appreciate and understand others and to cooperate in assisting them to achieve worthy aims. Now, Ferrer doesn't stop there, for he argues that it is in the enhancements of moral and social capacities that religious faith finds a footing, and by which the person of faith understands activities such as prayer, contemplation, and worship. These activities become fully integrated with the rest of one's active life because they affect one's relationships with others and with the natural world. And the religious person believes that in engaging in these activities, he is engaging his own mind and will with God. Now, in this way, the person of faith invokes the idea of double agency in an explanatory capacity. He believes that he is responding to a creative will. And so the idea of double agency functions like a supposition which, if true, would have an important bearing on one's conception of moral and social good and of our duties to others. The person of faith finds that the supposition is livable. It is working faith. And as long as it is not refuted by counter-evidence, including perhaps the discovery that religious faith is self-stultifying and destructive of the very things that most people aspire towards and hope for, hold dear, then he's entitled to retain the supposition. Well, our thinking tonight has taken many twists and turns, and we might well ask what its results are, what we've accomplished. I think we can draw some conclusions. As I indicated earlier, my main purpose was to survey a segment of scholarship on this issue, and had I aimed for a more technical approach, the lecture would have been more heavily analytical and logical and of much narrower scope. I might even have spent the whole time talking about this, you see. Well, what conclusions have we got? First, I think that the idea of